Before we begin, how are you feeling today? I hope you're okay and taking care of yourself. If today was a bad day, I'm glad you're here. Take a deep breath. This moment is yours. Ready? Let's begin. There's a certain kind of trust that forms when you share a home with someone. It's not always spoken, but it's there. In the casual sound of footsteps passing your door at night, in the quiet agreement to label your food in the fridge, in the unspoken rule that the space between rooms should be a neutral zone. You don't ask too many questions. You assume they sleep when they say they sleep. You believe the locked door stays locked. And in return, you offer the same illusion of transparency. But sometimes that trust is misplaced. Sometimes the person on the other side of the wall isn't just quirky or private or a little weird. Sometimes there's something else entirely. Something watching, something waiting, something building a version of you in the shadows while you go about your day thinking you're safe. And by the time you realize how wrong you were, you've already let them in. Into your space, your habits, your patterns, your fear. These 8 stories aren't fiction. They come from people who live with strangers that didn't just cross boundaries, they erased them. From locked freezers that whispered in the dark, to mirrors that blinked without reflection, to identities borrowed like coats in a cold room. These are stories of quiet invasions. And they serve as a reminder. When you share your space, you share your life, and not everyone deserves that access. So before you open your door again, you might want to listen closely to what happened when others did. Not all horrors begin with screams. Some arrive quietly, with a handshake and a smile, with the soft creak of a door closing behind a stranger you call roommate. And sometimes, what you share isn't just rent. It's proximity to something that should have stayed locked away. This first story begins in a quiet garage, where cold air hides more than just groceries, and a silence too still to be human. Story 1. Frozen Quiet. I moved to Fort Collins, Colorado for a fresh start, after a breakup that had gutted more than just my heart. The lease I broke, the friends I left, the clutter I sold off. None of it mattered compared to the silence I craved. I found a 1-story rental near the foothills, a quiet, pine-scented place owned by an older man named Jerry. You'll be sharing with my nephew, Kyle, he told me when I signed the papers. He keeps to himself, works late nights. You probably won't see much of him. Perfect. I didn't want to make friends. I didn't want bonding over pizza or roommates who asked how my day was. I wanted isolation with a lock on the door. Kyle wasn't home when I moved in. His room was down the hall, the door always shut. I kept mine closed too. The only shared areas were the kitchen and living room, and they stayed mostly untouched. A few sticky notes around the house reminded us of garbage day and thermostat rules. But one note was different. It was taped to a chest freezer in the garage, written in thick marker, "Do not open, Kyle's," underlined 3 times. The garage was dim and a bit colder than the rest of the house. I noticed the freezer hummed louder than it should. I told myself I didn't care. The first 2 weeks were uneventful. I'd started working at a small marketing agency, and the 40-minute commute became part of my rhythm. Kyle existed like a ghost. I'd hear the front door open at 3 a.m., hear soft footsteps, sometimes a voice murmuring through the wall, but we never exchanged more than glances. Then one night, the power flickered. It was late, and I was catching up on freelance work in the kitchen. The lights blinked and came back. No big deal. But the next morning, I noticed the garage door was open slightly. I hadn't touched it. The freezer's light was off. I flipped the switch. Nothing. And then the smell, subtle but wrong, like wet dog fur mixed with iron. The freezer was still locked, but I saw streaks of frost sliding down the sides, like it had defrosted slightly, only to freeze again. I stood there too long. Later that week, I got a whiff of the smell again. I lit a scented candle in my room and tried to forget it. Then one evening, I ran into Kyle in the hallway, our first real encounter. His hair was damp and his eyes looked like they hadn't closed in days. I told him something seemed off with the freezer. He stared at me, unspeaking, then said, "It's fine," and walked away. No emotion, no explanation, just that. I started keeping to myself even more. I told a neighbor about the smell, Mrs. Halverson, an older woman who always watered her plants and seemed to watch the neighborhood like a hawk. She leaned in, half whispering, "If that boy starts doing anything strange, you come straight to me. He's always been different." That same night, a loud thump woke me at 2:30 a.m. I froze in bed. Then came the dragging noise. It came from the garage. I crept to my door, cracked it open, listened. Faint voices. Kyle was whispering. I didn't catch the words, just the rhythm. Soft, careful, almost affectionate. It chilled me more than shouting ever could. The next morning, I texted Jerry, told him the smell was getting worse and the noises were keeping me up. He said he'd check in. That was all. No follow-up, no concern. A few days later, I came home to find a heavy package on the porch, addressed to Kyle, but unmarked. When I got inside, he was already hauling it toward the garage. He didn't say a word. That night, the freezer had not one, but 2 padlocks. I didn't sleep. I kept thinking about the dragging, the whispering, the way Kyle had stared at me like I was the one intruding. I started packing. Just essentials. Documents, clothes, laptop. My plan was to crash at a friend's in Denver. Before leaving, I made one last mistake. I went into the garage while Kyle was out, phone in hand, camera rolling. I didn't plan to open the freezer, just document what I could. The smell hit me hard this time. It wasn't just bad, it was angry, invasive. I panned my phone's light across the clutter. Boxes, shelves, tools. Then I saw the corner behind the freezer. Something had soaked into the drywall. Brown, almost black. Thick, congealed. Like blood, but not fresh. I staggered backward and almost dropped my phone. I fled the house that night. Didn't leave a note, didn't care about the deposit. I just left. 2 days later, Jerry called. Kyle had moved out. No explanation, no forwarding address. Jerry sounded shaken. He said he found the garage empty, freezer gone, stains scrubbed but still faint. I thought he was past that, he said. He had problems letting go of things, especially when they left him. I didn't ask what he meant. It took weeks before I stopped flinching at the sound of floorboards creaking. Months before, I could open my own freezer without instinctively checking for padlocks. And I'll never forget that feeling, the way your body knows before your mind accepts it. That something in your space isn't just wrong, it's dangerous. People always tell you to trust your gut. I used to think that was just something you said after a breakup or a bad job, but it's deeper than that. Your instincts are ancient. They've kept our species alive for a reason. So if you ever rent a place and your roommate tells you not to touch something, especially if it hums, or leaks, or smells like metal and meat, don't wait to find out why. Some doors stay closed for a reason. Some freezers should never be opened, and some people, no matter how quiet they seem, are holding back storms you don't want to be near when they break. If this story stayed with you, if it made you look over your shoulder or remember a time you ignored a bad feeling, stay with me. There's more to uncover, more stories that hit too close to home, and I want you here when we do. Sometimes the danger isn't what's inside the walls, but what reflects back from them. Mirrors don't just show who you are, Sometimes they remember versions of you you've never met, and sometimes the person who put them there isn't interested in decoration. They're building doorways. The next story takes us to Brooklyn, where a woman's art isn't just expression. It's an invitation to something watching from the other side. Story 2. Through the Silver Glass. I moved into the old brownstone in Brooklyn out of desperation more than choice. The rent was split 3 ways, and my room had just enough space for a twin bed, a desk, and a single window that looked out onto a brick wall. But after a year of couch surfing and a string of disappointing Craigslist viewings, I took it. My roommates were both women, Lila, who had lived there the longest, and Andrea, a quiet grad student who spent most of her time in the library. Lila was an artist, or at least that's how she introduced herself. Her room, which she never allowed anyone to enter, was at the far end of the apartment, and she filled the living room with ornate vintage mirrors. Dozens of them, framed in gold, silver, dark walnut. Some oval, some long and rectangular, others shaped like Gothic windows. She said she collected them from estate sales and antique markets upstate. The hallway walls were lined with them too, so wherever you walked in that place, you were reflected back at yourself from multiple angles, often in distorted glass. At first, I thought it was a harmless eccentricity. Artists are weird. I've met enough of them to know that. But as the days passed, I started to notice how carefully she arranged them, not just for decoration, but facing specific directions. Her favorite seemed to be the one hanging directly across from the kitchen entrance, a tall silver frame piece that curved slightly outward like a spoon. It caught you from the waist up when you walked in, and if you stood still, it almost felt like the reflection was delayed. Just a fraction of a second, enough to unsettle you if you stared too long. Andrea didn't seem to mind. We rarely crossed paths, and when we did, she offered a polite nod or a soft hey before retreating into her books. But Lila was always around. She never seemed to leave the apartment. I began to wonder if she even had a job, though packages kept arriving with art supplies, rolled up canvases, and oddly shaped boxes labeled fragile in cursive handwriting. The living room slowly morphed into a shrine of reflections. One night, I came home late and found every single mirror in the apartment turned inward toward the center of the room. I froze in the doorway, the dim light from the kitchen catching hundreds of angles of myself from behind. When I flicked on the light, Lila was there, sitting cross-legged on the floor in the middle of it all, staring into a hand mirror like it was whispering secrets. She looked up at me slowly, eyes heavy and distant. I asked if she was okay. She smiled faintly and said, "Just tuning the angles. They have to align." I didn't ask what that meant. I just went to my room and shut the door. But from that point on, things got stranger. I started having trouble sleeping. Not insomnia exactly, more like a feeling of being watched. I kept catching glimpses of myself in the mirror at the end of the hallway, even when I was sure I hadn't passed it. My reflection would linger longer than it should have. My posture seemed slightly different. Once, I saw myself blink before I had actually blinked. I tried to tell myself it was just exhaustion. City life, too much screen time, bad lighting, but deep down, I knew something was off. One night, I heard murmuring from Lila's room. Not words exactly, but soft, rhythmic sounds like humming layered with low whispers. The next morning, she was rearranging the mirrors again. That afternoon, I overheard her speaking to someone in her room, and I assumed Andrea had joined her. But when I walked by, the door was slightly ajar, and she was alone. Speaking softly to the largest mirror in her room, I only saw a sliver of it, but something about the way her reflection didn't move quite in sync with her body made my skin crawl. Things escalated when I came home early one day and found Andrea crying in the kitchen. She said she kept seeing a man in the mirrors. A tall, pale figure who stood perfectly still at the edge of the reflection, but was never there when she turned around. I asked her if she wanted to talk to Lila about it. She looked at me like I was insane and said, she knows. That's why she keeps bringing more of them in. She left that night and never came back. The apartment was quiet after Andrea left. Too quiet. Lila didn't seem surprised. She just took over Andrea's room and added another full-length mirror to the wall outside it. I was afraid to ask her anything by then. I just kept my head down, wore headphones, and avoided looking at my own face. But mirrors are hard to avoid when they're everywhere. One night, I caught my reflection smiling when I wasn't. It was brief, a flicker, a shadow at the edge of my grin, but I swear I saw teeth that weren't mine. I backed away, breath stuck in my chest, and slammed the door to my room. That was when I decided I had to get out. I didn't have a new place lined up, didn't care. I packed in the middle of the night, but as I was dragging my suitcase toward the front door, I felt something behind me, like static in the air, like being seen without consent. I turned, slowly, and caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. But it wasn't me. Not exactly. The stance was wrong. The eyes were wider, darker, and there was something standing behind me in the reflection. When I spun around, the hallway was empty. When I turned back, the mirror had gone dark, like silver swallowed by ink. I left everything else behind. Clothes, electronics, books. I didn't even close the door. I just walked until my legs gave out and called a friend from a gas station 6 blocks away. Some people say mirrors reflect more than just light. They remember, that they keep pieces of you long after you've walked away. I used to think that was poetry, something you put in a story to sound mysterious, but not anymore. Now, when I walk past a mirror in a public restroom or glance into a window after dark, I wonder if it remembers me, if a version of me is still trapped somewhere in that apartment, staring back at someone else, smiling when they're not. What I learned is simple. Pay attention to the things that seem small, the flicker of movement, the echo in a place that shouldn't echo, the way your own face looks a little too curious, because some homes don't need ghosts to be haunted, and some roommates invite things in without ever telling you what for. If this made your skin crawl, or reminded you of a moment where your reflection looked not quite right, stay with me. These aren't just stories, they're warnings. And the next one might be the one you've lived through without even knowing it. There's a particular kind of dread that grows in silence, the kind that starts as a question. What's that noise? And ends with the realization, I'm not alone. Some walls keep you safe, others breathe when you're not listening. And when that breathing comes from beneath you, it's no longer about paranoia. It's about survival. This next story comes from a basement in Portland, where the floor creaks for reasons no one dares explain. Story 3, Below the Floorboards. It was supposed to be a temporary arrangement. I just moved to Portland after accepting a job offer from a small documentary production studio, and the housing market was brutal. Everything decent was snatched up in hours, and I couldn't afford to sign a long-term lease with what I had left in savings. So, when I found an ad for a finished basement apartment on the southeast side, private entrance, all utilities included, no lease required, I responded immediately. Evelyn, the woman who owned the house, was in her 60s, friendly but brisk, and lived upstairs with her husband Richard. She gave me a quick tour of the basement space, a living area, a kitchenette, a small bedroom with a window facing the backyard. I didn't care that the ceilings were low or that the shower barely got warm. It was quiet, clean, and within my budget. The first few weeks were fine. Evelyn kept to herself. occasionally asking if the Wi-Fi was working or if I needed towels. She'd knock twice and leave things at the top of the basement stairs. Her husband, Richard, I only saw once. Tall, slow-moving, eyes heavy like he hadn't slept in days. He nodded but didn't speak. Evelyn said he was recovering from surgery. I never questioned it. But then the sound started. At first, I thought it was just old house noises, pipes knocking, wood settling. But this wasn't that. It always came late, around 1 or 2 in the morning. A faint scuffling, followed by creaks that moved across the ceiling like someone pacing barefoot. I figured it was Richard, restless from recovery. But when I brought it up casually over tea one afternoon, Evelyn's face stiffened. "We're in bed by 9 every night," she said, stirring her cup. "I'm sure it's just the house." Still, it kept happening. Sometimes I'd wake to the sound of whispering. Low, breathy, too soft to make out the words, but close enough to feel like someone was on the other side of the wall. Once, I was certain I heard a laugh, short and strained, coming from the air vent above my bed. I stopped sleeping through the night. I took to playing white noise on my phone just to drown it out. Then I noticed things going missing. Small things at first. A pair of socks, a phone charger, a half-finished notebook I always kept on my desk. Nothing valuable, just personal. Once, I found my toothbrush damp and out of place, like it had been used and set down in a rush. I started keeping all my essentials in a locked drawer. I even installed a cheap door alarm, the kind that beeps when opened. It wasn't enough. The scuffling got louder. The pacing became dragging, like someone pulling their feet along the floor. One night, I heard what sounded like furniture scraping, like a chair being dragged slowly across wood. I texted Evelyn, asking if everything was all right upstairs. She didn't respond. The next morning, she brought me a fresh towel and said nothing about the message. Then I met Leah, the woman who lived next door. We bumped into each other taking out trash. She asked how I was liking the place. And when I hesitated, she laughed, not unkindly, and said, "So the basement's still being rented out, huh?" When I asked what she meant, she looked around, then said, "You ever hear noises at night?" I nodded. Her face darkened. "We used to hear that too. Scraping, whispering. My brother stayed there for a month. Moved out without even asking for his deposit back. Said he felt like he was being watched through the vents." That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in bed with the lamp on, listening. Around 2 a.m., the dragging started again, but this time it was different. It wasn't above me. It was behind the far wall of my bedroom, a wall that, according to the floor plan Evelyn showed me, was just storage. I pressed my ear to the drywall. There it was, breathing, slow, wet, close. The next morning, I confronted Evelyn. I didn't accuse her, just told her I was uncomfortable, that I needed to know what was behind that wall. Her reaction was instant and sharp. "That part of the basement is sealed. Has been for years. You don't need to go near it." She walked away before I could respond. I couldn't let it go. The following day, while Evelyn was out running errands, I'd seen her leave. I grabbed a flashlight and pulled my bed away from the wall. There was a small panel, about 2 feet wide, almost unnoticeable unless you were looking. I hesitated, hand shaking, then pried it open. Behind it was a narrow crawl space. Dirt floor, wooden beams. It smelled like mildew and old copper. I crouched down, aimed my flashlight inside, and nearly dropped it. There were clothes, a pile of them. Socks, t-shirts, shoes, some of them mine, others unfamiliar, folded neatly, stacked like offerings. On the far side of the space, I saw what looked like a blanket-covered lump. I didn't move closer. I didn't need to. I backed out slowly, replaced the panel, shoved the bed back in place, and left. I never returned. I didn't even pack. I called a friend, crashed on their couch, and later paid someone to go collect my things during the day. Weeks later, a news story came out about the house. A neighbor had called in a welfare check after not seeing Evelyn or Richard for days. Police found the house empty, no signs of struggle, but in the crawl space behind the basement wall, they found multiple bags containing personal items from former tenants. A few of them matched missing persons reports from the last 5 years. No bodies were ever recovered. Sometimes when I think back to that place, I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't asked questions. If I'd ignored the breathing, the dragging, the sense of being watched. Some people go missing in broad daylight. Others disappear slowly, item by item, dream by dream, until the house itself forgets they were ever there. What I learned in that basement wasn't just about danger. It was about trust. The kind we give too freely. The kind we ignore when our gut twists at night. If something feels wrong, it probably is. And if a wall breathes, if it watches, if it remembers, get out. Don't wait for the story to explain itself. Your safety is not a puzzle to be solved. And if you've ever lived somewhere that made your skin crawl for no clear reason, you're not alone. Trust your instincts. Stay curious, but never at the cost of your safety. If stories like this make you check behind your walls or remind you of somewhere you should have left sooner, stick around. There are more truths buried in silence than you think, and I'm here to help unearth them, one story at a time. Some people watch you through peepholes. Others prefer to capture you piece by piece, on canvas. But what happens when the portrait stares back? When the brushstroke isn't art, but possession? The next story takes place in Salem, where an artist paints with obsession, and every face she creates loses a part of itself, until someone finally sees themselves too clearly. Story 4. Portraits Without Eyes. I moved to Salem, Massachusetts for a teaching job at a small arts college nestled in one of the town's many colonial brick buildings. I rented the upstairs room of an old Victorian house on Chestnut Street, close enough to walk to campus and far enough from downtown that the tourist noise died down after dusk. The house was owned by a middle-aged couple who lived in the basement unit. They'd recently renovated the top floor, dividing it into 2 bedrooms with a shared kitchen. The other tenant was a woman named Ivy. She was around my age, early 30s, soft-spoken, with long dark hair that she wore in a tight braid down her back. She introduced herself the day I moved in, but didn't say much beyond a polite, "Welcome." I assumed she was either shy or just private. That didn't bother me. I wasn't looking for a roommate to be friends with. I just needed a quiet place to sleep. Ivy was an artist, the kind who didn't advertise it loudly, but whose presence somehow seeped into every space she inhabited. She kept most of her materials in her room, but on the second week, I noticed she had set up a small folding easel in the living room, right next to the bay window. I tried not to intrude, but it was hard to ignore her work. She painted portraits. At first, I thought they were incomplete studies, faces rendered in meticulous detail, cheekbones, hair texture, skin tone captured with eerie accuracy. But none of them had eyes. Not blank, not missing, just left undone, as if the canvas itself rejected them. The sockets remained smooth, as if erased or never meant to be there in the first place. I never asked her about it. Something in me hesitated every time I thought to bring it up. There was a stillness to Ivy that didn't invite questions. She painted mostly at night, long after I'd gone to bed. I'd wake sometimes around 2 or 3 a.m. and hear the soft brush strokes through the wall. Rhythmic, careful, steady. I once got up for water and found her sitting completely still in front of a canvas, staring into it like she expected it to speak. One evening, after a particularly long faculty meeting, I came home to find a new portrait on the wall near the front door. It hadn't been there that morning. The face was unfamiliar, male, mid-40s maybe, with graying hair and an angular jaw. No eyes, like the others, but this one felt different. The expression, if you could call it that, felt strained, like the man had been caught mid-thought. His mouth was parted slightly. The muscles around his cheek were tight. I stood there longer than I meant to. The painting made my skin crawl, though I couldn't explain why. When I asked Ivy about it the next day, she simply said, "He showed up in a dream," and turned back to her tea. After that, more paintings appeared. One every few days, always near the entryway, all different faces, all eyeless. I tried to ignore them. I told myself, artists work through strange themes, that Ivy was just expressing something psychological, symbolic, whatever. But then I started to recognize some of the faces, not completely, just fragments. Someone who looked like the barista at the coffee shop I went to, a man who resembled the campus janitor, my department chair's wife, though aged and changed. I wondered if it was coincidence, if she was pulling references from local people unconsciously, but it didn't feel that way. Then, one morning, I saw a new portrait hung lower than the rest. The frame was smaller, simpler. The face was mine, my hair, my jaw, my slightly crooked nose. No eyes, of course. Just an eerie, feature-perfect rendering of the rest of me. I froze. Something inside me recoiled, not from fear, but a deeper, more primal discomfort, like being touched without consent. When Ivy emerged from the kitchen, I asked her why she painted me. She blinked slowly and said, "You were looking at the others for too long. They noticed." I didn't reply. I couldn't. The next few days, I kept my head down. I avoided the living room. I avoided Ivy. But the atmosphere in the apartment changed. At night, I heard footsteps in the hallway that didn't match Ivy's light tread. I'd wake to find the hallway light on, though I never left it that way. One night, I found all the portraits turned toward the wall, as if someone or something had tried to hide their gaze, even if it was eyeless. I started sleeping with my bedroom door locked. I pushed a chair under the handle. I stopped drinking coffee at home and took my laptop to the library instead of working in the kitchen, but it followed me. One afternoon, I caught sight of a face in the library window, a face with my mouth, my jawline, but no eyes. I blinked and it was gone. Maybe it had never been there. Then came the final painting. It appeared without a frame, just leaning against the inside of my door when I came home one night. I almost tripped over it. This time it wasn't just a face, it was my entire body, sleeping in my bed. The covers pulled up to my chin. The room around me painted in exacting detail. The bookshelf, the curtains, the cracked lampshade I hadn't replaced. The only thing missing were my eyes. The sockets were blank, but there was something underneath. A faint shimmer. A shadow trying to rise through the canvas. I moved out that night. I didn't wait. I packed only what I could grab in 20 minutes and drove to a friend's house in Marblehead. I never went back. I never asked for my deposit. I left the key on the steps and blocked Ivy's number. A few months later, I received a small, unmarked envelope in the mail. Inside was a single photograph of a painting, another portrait. The figure was unfamiliar, and yet deeply familiar. The pose, the posture, the angle of the neck. It looked like someone who had lived inside my skin once, but no longer did. The figure had no eyes, but the sockets were no longer smooth. There were shadows in them now, as if something had settled in. Some people believe art can capture souls, that to paint someone's likeness is to trap a piece of them. I never used to believe in that. I do now. I believe that when you stare into something long enough, it learns to stare back. And some reflections don't need glass to follow you. If you've ever felt watched by something that shouldn't have eyes, or seen yourself somewhere you didn't put yourself, pay attention. Trust the shiver that runs down your spine. It's not always fear. Sometimes it's recognition. And if you ever meet someone like Ivy, someone who doesn't just observe the world but invites something through it, leave before your image becomes more real than you. Most people fear who lives next door, but sometimes the real fear is discovering no one lives there at all. Or worse, someone used to and never quite left. The following story comes from San Diego, where an empty apartment isn't empty at all, and the hallway outside your door may carry more than just echoes. Story 5. The Tenant Who Wasn't There. I moved into the apartment in San Diego at the tail end of August, when the ocean breeze still carried heat and the sidewalks hummed with sun. The building was nothing special. Stucco exterior, 3 stories, faded green trim. But it had parking, a working air conditioner, and more importantly, a vacancy. The landlord was a wiry, half-retired man named Cliff, who told me I'd be living on the 2nd floor. Apartment 2B. You'll share the floor with one other unit, he said. That's 2A. Guy's quiet, works night shifts. You probably won't see him. That suited me fine. I was starting a new job, trying to rebuild after a breakup that had stretched out far too long. And the idea of minimal interaction was exactly what I wanted. The apartment itself was modest, clean enough, a bit worn, with a view of a parking lot and the corner of a liquor store across the street. I unpacked in a couple of hours, bought takeout, and started to settle into a new rhythm. But by the end of the first week, I started to notice oddities. Nothing dramatic, just absence. In a building with thin walls, I never heard a single sound from 2A. No footsteps, no music, no creaking floorboards. The blinds across the hall remained tightly shut, the doormat always undisturbed. Packages were never left by the door. No mail ever peeked out of the metal slot. One night, I passed the unit on my way to take out trash and noticed something strange. The smell. Faint, almost medicinal, like alcohol wipes and rust. It stopped me for a moment, but I shrugged it off. Old buildings trap smells. That's what I told myself. The following week, I ran into Cliff in the parking lot and casually mentioned I hadn't seen the neighbor yet. His face twitched, subtle, but there. Like I said, he works nights, he muttered, then changed the subject. Too fast. That's when the silence stopped feeling neutral and started feeling staged. The next night, around 3 a.m., I heard something. A dragging noise, slow and deliberate, across the hallway floor. I sat up in bed and held my breath. The sound stopped just outside my door. I waited for a knock, a footstep, anything, but there was nothing. I got up, opened the door a crack, and peered out. The hallway was empty. The smell was back, stronger this time. Metallic, stale. I slept with the light on. In the following days, the feeling of being watched grew. Subtle things. A shift in the air, a click in the wall, that prickling sensation at the back of your neck. I started double locking my door. I kept the blinds drawn, but the dread didn't leave. A week later, I came home from work and found the door to 2A slightly ajar. It hadn't been like that in the morning. I hesitated, keys in hand, staring at the gap. The hallway was quiet, too quiet. Against every instinct I had, I stepped forward and nudged the door with my foot. The unit was dark. I called out. Nothing. I reached inside and flipped the switch. Light flickered on, dim and yellowed. The apartment was empty. Not empty as in someone went to work empty, but empty as in uninhabited. No furniture, no dishes, dust thick on the floor. A mattress leaned against the far wall like it had been left there in a hurry. No sheets, no signs of life. I backed away and shut the door. The next morning, I confronted Cliff. I told him what I saw, that no one had been living there. He didn't deny it, just sighed, deep and tired. The guy who lived there moved out 3 months ago, he admitted. Didn't tell me, just vanished. I've been waiting to relist it until the paperwork clears. I asked why he didn't say anything. Why keep up the lie? Cliff looked at me, and for the first time, he looked older. Because people don't like living next to an empty unit. They get weird about it. Start imagining things, hearing things. I wanted to be angry, but I couldn't, because I had heard things. And now, they were getting worse. That night, the dragging returned. This time it moved past my door, slow and steady, like someone pulling something heavy. I didn't open the door. I sat on the floor with my back against it, heart pounding. Around 3:30 a.m., the hallway light went out. My apartment filled with cold. Over the next week, things escalated. Objects in my apartment were out of place. The bathroom mirror had a smear on it like someone had leaned in too close. I'd find the hallway light on when I was sure I'd turned it off. Once, I came home to find muddy footprints leading from my door to the stairwell. Not mine. One night, I heard knocking. Not on my door, but from inside the walls. Soft, persistent. I pressed my ear against the drywall, and I swear I heard breathing. Deep, raspy, close. That was it. I packed a bag and left to stay at a friend's place in North Park. I told Cliff I was breaking the lease. He didn't argue. A month later, I checked the listings just out of curiosity. 2A was still unlisted. I drove by the building one last time. A single light was on in the window of 2A. It flickered, then went dark. Sometimes people don't really leave. Sometimes places remember them in ways we can't see. Silence can be a performance. Stillness can be camouflage. And sometimes, what's scarier than a haunted apartment is an apartment that's trying very hard to pretend it isn't. If you ever find yourself living next to someone you never see, someone who leaves no trace, no sound, no smell, don't accept it at face value. Ask questions. Notice the patterns. And if you get that feeling, the one where the hallway seems too quiet and the walls feel too close, don't wait for proof. Trust your discomfort. It's there to protect you. If this story hit too close to home, or if you've ever felt watched by something that wasn't there, stay with me. These stories aren't just tales, they're reminders. And the next one might be the one you've already lived without knowing it. Some roommates are strange, others bring something with them. Something old, something watching, something that understands the weight of salt and the meaning of circles. The next story leads us to Savannah, where boundaries aren't drawn with locks or leases, but with rituals meant to hold something barely contained, until it no longer is. Story 6, Salt Circles. I moved to Savannah, Georgia at the beginning of spring, drawn by the promise of coastal fog and old world charm. I found a rental on the edge of the historic district, a narrow 2-story home converted into 3 apartments. Mine was the ground floor unit. Old wooden floors, tall windows with crooked frames, and a faint scent of lavender and mildew baked into the walls. It wasn't perfect, but it had personality. The kind of place you could pretend had secrets but nothing to worry about. My upstairs neighbor was a woman named Laurie. She was maybe a few years older than me, worked at an antique store near the waterfront, and had that calm, measured cadence of someone who didn't like small talk but always nodded politely. She wore long sleeves even in warm weather, and her keys jingled with more charms than metal. The first time I noticed anything strange was a week after I moved in. I came home late from a work event and saw a faint dusting of white powder just outside my door. At first, I thought someone had dropped something, maybe cleaning supplies or baking soda. But the next morning, it was there again. A thin, broken circle, smudged like it had been disturbed and redrawn. I wiped it away with my shoe and forgot about it. Lori didn't speak much, but she always seemed to be walking. I'd hear her pacing late at night, steps slow and steady above my ceiling. Once or twice, I saw her standing in the backyard, facing the tree line that separated the property from the neighbor's fence, perfectly still. It wasn't threatening, just odd. A few days later, I came home early and passed her on the stairwell. She stopped, looked at me carefully, then said, "If you hear scratching, don't open the door. It doesn't like to be seen." I thought she was joking. Her face didn't say she was joking. That night, I didn't hear scratching. I heard humming, low and slow, like someone trying to remember a lullaby through broken teeth. It came from the vents. I turned up the TV and blamed old pipes. The next morning, I found another salt circle. This time it was inside, right in front of my bedroom door. My windows had been locked. The front door was bolted. I knocked on Lori's door to ask about it, but no one answered. The antique store said she hadn't come into work. I didn't sleep well that night. I left the light on in the bathroom and closed every door between me and the humming. It grew louder. Not every night, just the ones before the air pressure changed. The air would get heavy, like the sky was leaning in. That's when the humming would return. That's when the salt would appear. I began to research things I didn't believe in. Wards, rituals, spirits that fed on attention. I convinced myself it was stress. New city, new job, unfamiliar rhythms. But then I started seeing it. In the corners, in the glass. A shape that wasn't there if I looked directly, but always just outside center. Tall, too thin, no face, just the sense of one. It would be gone in a blink, but my heart would remember it long after my eyes forgot. Lori came down to my door one night without knocking. She just stood there until I opened it. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her voice hoarse. She handed me a jar of salt and said, "It likes boundaries. It respects them, until it doesn't." I asked her what it was. She just shook her head and said, "It came with me, but it's old. Older than you, older than here. It followed the bones." I didn't ask what bones. That week I began waking up with scratches on my arms. Not deep, not even painful, but deliberate. Parallel, clean, like something with too many fingers had traced patterns across my skin. I started placing salt around the vents, the baseboards, the windowsills. Lori taught me how to draw binding marks with chalk on wood. I followed her instructions. I didn't sleep, but I felt safer. Then one morning, Lori was gone. Her door was open, her apartment was empty. No furniture, no clothes, no paintings, just salt, mounds of it, piled in the corners, poured along every seam of every wall. Her bathtub was filled with it. Her bed was gone, replaced by a wide, perfectly drawn circle etched into the hardwood. In the center, a small, blackened tooth. I didn't stay another night. I moved out by the end of the day, packed in silence. Left half my things behind. Cliff, the landlord, didn't even blink when I told him. Said people didn't last long in that unit anyway. Too drafty, he muttered. Too many creaks. Months later, I got a message from someone who rented the same place after me. They found my number written in pencil behind the fridge. They asked if the salt meant anything. I told them yes. I told them don't sweep it up. I told them, if they hear humming, light a candle. If they find salt moved, move with it. And if they wake up and the air feels too still, run. Some people carry things with them, wounds, spirits, memories shaped like knives, and sometimes what follows them isn't entirely theirs to contain. I learned that some boundaries are made of wood and walls, others are made of instinct and the bitter bite of minerals. So if you move into a place that smells like rain but never leaks, that creaks when you're still, that hums when you pray, trust the signs. Don't wait for proof. Don't need to believe in something for it to believe in you. And if this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of a hallway you avoided, a mirror you covered, a door you never opened, then stay close. These stories are more than memories. They're warnings, and you might need them sooner than you think. When you live in the cold long enough, you learn to trust your compass. But what happens when your room moves while you sleep? When the walls you marked yesterday bend by morning? In the next story, set deep in the remote cold of Alaska, a man learns that not all spaces are fixed, and sometimes the room forgets who it belongs to. Story 7. Shifted Walls. I took the job in Anchorage, Alaska, because I thought isolation would be good for me. I'd spent most of my 20s in a blur of overstimulation, cities that never slept, friends who never stopped talking, and a nervous system that never seemed to quiet down. When the opportunity came to manage logistics for a seasonal research facility outside the city, I said yes before I finished reading the contract. The housing arrangement was simple. A prefab unit, one of 8 arranged in a half circle like temporary shelters, all connected by planks elevated above the snow-packed ground. They called it Camp Hartley, though there was no campfire, no laughter, and nothing warm about it except the radiator hum in the walls. I was assigned to Unit 4, a rectangular space just big enough for a cot, a desk, a mini fridge, and a sense of persistent loneliness. The first few days were normal. Quiet, cold, predictable. I spent most of my time organizing supplies, checking inventory, and sending updates back to the main office via satellite link. There were only 5 of us living in camp at the time, including Nate, a technician who stayed in Unit 3 next to mine. He was quiet, polite, and carried a permanent look of mild confusion, like he just walked into a conversation that started without him. He'd worked a few seasons already and told me the hardest part wasn't the snow or the silence. It was keeping track of what changed. I didn't understand what he meant until I woke up one morning and found the light switch in a different spot. It had moved. Not dramatically, just a few inches to the left. Enough that I reached in the wrong place. At first, I assumed it was fatigue, muscle memory playing tricks. But then I noticed other things. My desk, which had always sat flush with the right wall, suddenly had a half-inch gap behind it. The radiator vent was quieter, as if the wall had thickened. I measured the width of the room out of curiosity. It was 6 inches shorter than the day before. I told Nate. He nodded slowly, then asked, "Did you dream last night?" I had, though I couldn't remember what. Just the vague sensation of being pushed, gently but firmly, by something that didn't have hands. He told me it happened to him too. First the measurements change, then the angles, then the windows don't line up with the outside anymore. I laughed, waiting for the joke, but he didn't smile. He said the first time it happened to him, he woke up facing the wrong direction. Not metaphorically, literally. The bed had moved 90 degrees. He chalked it up to sleepwalking, or maybe bad memory, until it happened again, and again. Over the next week, I kept track. I drew lines on the floor with chalk. I placed coins in the corners of the room. Every night, something shifted. Walls pulled in, shelves tilted slightly, even the ceiling vent moved a few degrees clockwise. It wasn't fast, it wasn't loud, it was just inevitable. Like the room had its own slow heartbeat, and every night it exhaled and rearranged itself slightly. I started to dread sleep. I drank more coffee, stayed up later, listened for sounds, scrapes, breathing, anything to explain it. But the nights were silent. I asked the others if they noticed anything strange. One of them, Dana, said she'd woken up once with her blankets tucked so tightly around her that she couldn't move her arms. Another, Joel, claimed he heard footsteps pacing outside his unit at night, but when he checked, no prints appeared in the snow. Then, one morning, I opened my door and stepped out onto the plank, and my unit was no longer between units 3 and 5. It was next to Unit 1. I stood there for a long time, trying to understand. The layout of the camp was fixed. We hadn't moved, but my door no longer faced the same direction. The sun rose from the wrong side. The wind pushed from the opposite corner. I ran to Nate's unit, pounded on the door. He answered with a knowing look. "It's not you," he said. "The buildings move, not far, not fast, but just enough to get lost." I asked why no one reported it. He shrugged. By the time people realize it's happening, they're too embarrassed. Or they leave. I asked him what happens if you stay too long. He looked past me and said, "You start to feel like maybe you're the one that's wrong, not the room." That night, I didn't sleep. I wedged my cot against the door and sat with my back to the wall. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke to the sound of a knock, but it wasn't at the door. It was from beneath the floor, soft, rhythmic, like someone tapping out a code. I froze. The tapping stopped. Then, slowly, it started again, closer, more insistent. I dropped to the floor and pressed my ear against the cold metal paneling. There was breathing. Wet, shallow, human but not quite. And then a whisper, barely audible. Shift. I left the next day. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't explain. I just packed what I could and radioed the main office to request an early return. They didn't ask questions. I don't think they wanted answers. Sometimes I still wake up in my apartment and reach for a light switch that isn't there. I measure the walls. I mark the floor. I try to remember which way the sun rises. Not because I think it followed me, but because I need to know it didn't. Some places don't stay still. Some buildings are built on land that remembers too much. Or maybe it's not the land. Maybe it's something deeper. Something that only shows itself when the noise of the world finally stops. Something that waits for the quiet to slide in and make space where there was none before. If you've ever woken up and felt like the room was wrong, like the dimensions betrayed you, like the angles no longer made sense, don't ignore that feeling. Spaces shift, time folds, and sometimes the place you think you know decides to make you forget. And if this story made you look around your room a little longer than usual, you're not alone. Stay with me. There are more stories that tilt reality just slightly, enough to make you wonder if the walls were always where they are now. Most roommates borrow food or steal your shampoo, but some borrow something deeper, your words, your memories, your identity, until you no longer recognize the version of yourself they've replaced you with. This final story happens in Chicago, where a seemingly harmless roommate isn't trying to get close. She's trying to become. Story 8. Borrowed Identity. When I first moved to Chicago, I was just looking to start over. I'd left behind a long relationship, a draining job, and a version of myself I no longer recognized. All I wanted was a quiet apartment, a steady paycheck, and a place to disappear into for a while. I found a listing online for a 2-bedroom unit in an older brownstone near Logan Square. Nothing fancy, but it had charm. Brick walls, high ceilings, and the kind of creaky floors that made you feel like the building had a memory. The rent was reasonable, and the ad mentioned a roommate named June. That was it. Just June. We met at a coffee shop before I moved in. She was in her mid-20s, Pale, wiry, with the kind of carefully messy hair that suggested she cared a lot about looking like she didn't. She asked me a few questions: what I did for work, why I was moving, if I liked pets, and smiled the whole time, like she already knew the answers. She told me she worked remotely, liked quiet evenings, and was looking for someone low-key. I fit the bill. We signed the lease the next day. For the first few weeks, things were fine. June was polite, clean, and mostly kept to herself. She cooked late at night sometimes, soups and teas that filled the apartment with unfamiliar spices, and always seemed to be rearranging things on the shelves. Small objects, trinkets, a glass bead shaped like an eye, a feather wrapped in twine, a coin that looked older than the country. I didn't ask questions. I didn't want to get involved. I worked long hours and came home exhausted, just happy to have a door I could close. But I started noticing things. My keys weren't where I left them. My towel was damp before I showered. Once, I came home and the lamp in my bedroom was turned slightly toward the door, like someone had been standing in the room, staring. I asked June if she'd gone into my room. She looked genuinely surprised and said no. I wouldn't, she added. That's your space. She said it kindly, reassuring, but something about the way she emphasized the word your made my skin crawl. Then came the dreams. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, certain I'd heard my name, not shouted, whispered, right next to my ear. The dreams were vivid. I was walking through the apartment, but everything was reversed. My room was hers. The pictures on the wall were all photos of me, candid, detailed, impossibly specific. In one dream, I saw myself sleeping, and June stood beside my bed, touching the edge of my pillow with a look that wasn't curiosity. It was ownership. I tried to brush it off. I was under stress. My therapist said new environments could trigger subconscious fears. I tried to believe that, until I got a message from an old coworker. It was short. Hey, weird question, but are you back on LinkedIn? Just saw your profile pop up. New job title, new photo. I checked. Someone had created a new account using my name, my education, my last job, but a different photo. June's face, my background, her eyes. I confronted her that night. I didn't accuse her directly, just mentioned the account. She laughed, soft and controlled. That's creepy, she said. You should report it. The next morning, the account was gone. I started looking through the apartment more closely. I found a shoebox in the hall closet with copies of my resume, printouts of emails I'd sent, a receipt from a grocery store I'd never been to with my name on it. It wasn't just mimicry, it was construction. She was building a version of me. I packed a bag that night and stayed with a friend. I didn't tell June. I left without a word. A week later, I came back during the day with the landlord to get the rest of my things. The apartment was quiet, empty. The door to June's room was open. Inside, the walls were covered with photos, most of them of me, at work, at the store, at my friend's house, photos I'd never seen anyone take. The landlord told me no one named June was ever on the lease. The original tenant had been someone else. Different name, same description. I filed a report with the police. They couldn't do much. No crime had been committed, no identity officially stolen, just lines blurred until they bled. Months later, I moved again, changed cities, started fresh. But every now and then, someone will tag me in a photo on social media. Someone who looks almost like me, but not quite. A stranger in the background with my clothes, my smile, June's eyes. I've learned that identity isn't always taken violently. Sometimes it's borrowed, piece by piece, gently, with care. Until one day you wake up and realize someone else knows how to be you better than you do. If you ever get the feeling that someone is studying you, not watching, not stalking, but studying, trust it. If they ask too many questions, if they laugh just a second too late, if they mirror your words a little too often, listen to that inner flinch. Some people don't want to be close, they want to become. And if this story reminded you of someone who got under your skin a little too deeply, or a time you felt like you were slowly fading out of your own life, stay close. These stories aren't just horror, they're reminders of how fragile the lines are between us, and how easy they are to cross. 8 stories, 8 doors that never should have been opened. 8 reminders that sometimes the danger isn't out there, it's in the room with you. And as each of these stories fades into silence, they leave behind a question that echoes louder than any scream. Who are you really living with? And how long until they show you who they truly are? Now that you've heard all 8 stories, I hope you understand one thing. The scariest part of living with someone isn't the noise they make at night. It's the silence that hides what they truly are. Each of these stories began with trust. Trust in an ad, a handshake, a first impression over coffee. Trust in the idea that someone can enter your life, sleep 20 feet away from you, and still be harmless. But harmless isn't a given. Harmless is earned, and sometimes it's faked. Some of these people escaped. Others were lucky enough to see the signs in time. A few still don't know what they lived with. That's the part that sticks with me. The idea that you can live beside something dangerous, something watching, something wearing your habits like a mask, and never know until it's too late. That you can walk past a closed door 100 times and never guess what's behind it. But now you know. Now you've seen what others have survived. And maybe next time you notice your toothbrush is wet when it shouldn't be, or your keys aren't where you left them, you won't laugh it off. These stories weren't meant to scare you. They were meant to arm you with awareness, with caution, with the uncomfortable truth that even the safest spaces can hide the sharpest threats. So take them with you, and if you ever get that feeling in your gut, that twitch of suspicion you can't explain, listen. That's the part of you trying to survive.